Hi, everybody. Chad Lefebvre here with The Most Important Conversations, also the author of the Substack Source Code. Today, I want to talk about something that is an observation I've been making for quite a while, which is that the world is becoming more conservative. Why is the world becoming more conservative, and what does that actually mean? And is this something you, in fact, want? Or is this a part of a trend that I've noticed in just sort of observing human behavior over many decades, and then also through the history books, where we tend to, as human beings, swing in these wild pendulums from wild swings to liberalism to and more sort of that loose, free, open way of doing things, to wild swings back to conservatism, which, interestingly enough, a lot of conservatives equate conservatism with freedom, which doesn't make any sense to me, and we're going to cover that today. This is such an important topic to think about for yourself, because it's very easy for us to get wound up and carried by the current of culture. And the current of culture right now, in many respects, is moving wildly towards the direction of a more conservative way of living. We're seeing the rise of right-wing groups around the world rising up, that conservative undertone coming off of the backs of what was a very liberal 1990s, liberal 2000s, which just in my observations was interrupted and disrupted by the economic crisis of 2008. And then we've been in this liminal space, this period since then, where it's been a little bit of a shuffling tug of war between the liberal culture and the more conservative culture, vying to see who's going to come out. And then, of course, we get hit by COVID. And that's sort of the second crisis in a decade, effectively, a little bit more than a decade. And I think it's kind of sealed the deal that the momentum or the trend is towards extreme conservatism. But this is not necessarily a good thing. And I want to be really clear, because I know that in the all around the world, but particularly in the United States and some other places, is a very hot button issue right now. People are very politically charged. People are very reactive, very reactionary, very defensive. And so I'm inviting you to listen from a place. This is not a judgment, it's an observation, but I want you to invite you to listen from a place where you would take this opportunity through this short dialogue today that I want to have with you to reconsider what effectively is important to you, effectively meaning in your life, that it would actually be a lived experience. And do you want to move to more conservatism, or are you just finding yourself carried by the momentum of this wild swing that we are on right now? So it's really important to take a step back and to look at our life in the context of a broader society, and our society in the context of sort of a broader trajectory of what's going on in the world. We're seeing a lot of conservative movements, of course, in the United States, in Australia, Canada, Europe, in the West, let's call it, on the march and on the rise, specifically after COVID, but also it was starting to happen even during COVID and maybe even a little bit before. I would say, the first sort of swing that we started to notice was with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Although the culture hadn't really moved forcefully into a conservative direction yet at that point, but it was the beginnings of that. And again, I think the seed or the inception of that was the economic crisis of 2008. Now, there's something important to observe about this. The seed of conservatism is, and I can't think of a single example in world history, is always fear. Always. People retract, people they shrink themselves, they pull in, they go into a safe zone when there is some kind of trauma. It's sort of like, oh my gosh, we've stepped too far out into what's possible, into the unknown. Let's retract, let's pull back. Maybe we were getting ahead of ourselves. And what's interesting about this is that it was actually conservative monetary policy and economics. And I'm not going to go into a whole economic thing. I don't want to bore you if it's not your thing, but just understand that it was largely driven by a conservative economic policy. Now, if I'm just talking about the United States, the economic policy began in the Clinton administration, but was reinforced and doubled down on during the George W. Bush administration of deregulating banks, which led to the mortgage crisis, the failure of banks, and the whole 2008 crisis. So it's interesting that it was a conservative monetary policy, which since Reagan has tended to believe in. And it's kind of backwards when you think about it, because you think deregulation would mean more loose rules, more freedom. That should be the thing of the liberal side of the political and cultural equation. But ever since the Reagan administration, deregulation has been the hallmark of conservatism. And so this deregulation led to the collapse of the economy in 2008, which has now led to planted the seeds, which led to an even more conservative retraction in. And so what happens when we try to retract is we're trying to gain back control. It feels like we've gone way too far out past our comfort zone, and so we want to retract and come back. That's a very conservative thing. Think about what the word means, to conserve, okay? This is not a mentality of, wild entrepreneurship, imagining anything that's possible, risk-taking. That's more on the left or liberal side of sort of that political dynamic and societal dynamic. The conservative mindset is to conserve, to retract. The proclivity of conservatism is to look into the past for answers for what to do in the future, which incidentally makes no sense whatsoever at all. We live in a period of time right now that is unrivaled in human history in terms of the speed of change that we're experiencing, the complexity and the nature of that change that we are experiencing, meaning there's nothing in the past that can forecast or give us any real insights about what's coming. Nothing at all. AI didn't exist in the past. The problems that we're experiencing with social media and the isolation and the separation that we've been experiencing over the last 14 or so years of humanity being in their little perceptual isolated bubbles, that hasn't existed prior to that. So there's nothing in history that can really show us for what to do there. We're at a moment of time, ironically, where we're moving simultaneously into conservative thinking, into tropes of the past. And I'm going to explain a little bit what I mean by that in a second. At the very moment in time when what we need is expansiveness. We need creativity. We need innovation. We need new thinking. We need new ideas. We need people to start to come together to communicate with one another, to share their views of a possible future, and to collaborate and to create together to create that future. Incidentally, this is the whole premise underlining the foundation of the most important conversations in TMIC, is to maximize the development of creativity as a way of being in our individual lives, as a way of being in our organizations and in our institutions. Now, that way of being, creativity, has been beaten out of us for the last 100 or so years, largely by conservative policy, by conservative frameworks, and by a conservative way of living. We have, after the Second World War, when the rise of corporations really expanded, and there was this idea in the 1950s and the 1960s that if you were going to get a job, if you followed the rules, very conservative idea, follow the rules, get a job, work for a single company, and you would be guaranteed what we now know as the American dream. You'll be able to buy a house, you'll have 2 cars, the whole thing, which is crumbling underneath us right now. So this is coming out of the Second World War, you can imagine there was this moment of rein it all in. Let's get ourselves organized. Let's just go to basics. Let's build a foundation upon which we can, elevate and advance our society. And I'm not saying that was a bad thing. Coming out of a trauma like the Second World War, it would be natural to want to conserve. Then what happens? After about 20 years of that, conservative, just, trying to control all of the variables of life, we get the sexual revolution in the 1960s. We get an explosion of arts. We get an explosion of creativity, which is right brain thinking versus left. So when we're talking about conservative thinking, it's about managing the variables of life, managing the logistics of life. That's very left brain. Works really good for a corporate and institutional environment. We don't want creative people, right brain people, thinking outside the box, feeling and expressing their emotions, getting any funny ideas, so to speak. We want people to just manage the logistics, abide by the rules, fall in line. That's very left brain. So the 1960s comes around, starts to challenge 20 years of conservatism. Again, the part of the problem we have is this polarization where we are at war with one or the other. What we need to do is create a context where both and can exist. Okay, so I'm not anti-conservative and I'm not anti-liberal, and I'm not ultimately pro-liberal or pro-conservative. I believe that if we can use the tools of creativity and we can appreciate what is powerful and impactful and effective from the creative, expansive, anything is possible, liberal way of engaging the world, and then also take from the conservative side of things those elements that preserve a foundation, and we bring those two together, that's the ideal. As a society, we have not done that well. We're either way over here or way over here. We're either way left, way right. And so the 1960s emerges this explosion of the arts, which was wonderful, great music, great art, new ideas, which was sort of the counterculture, as they've called it, countering. Well, what culture were they countering? They were countering conservatism, the conservatism that had dominated for 20 years up until that point. And then we go through the mid-1960s into the 1970s. Ronald Reagan gets elected, and there's another wave pendulum swing back to the conservatism of the 1980s, at least politically speaking. The 1980s were an interesting time because it was sort of a blend. It was like a decade of, we had this conservative political thing going on with Ronald Reagan in the United States, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and then other conservative governments around the world. But the conservatism back then wasn't at an extreme level. It was the beginning of what we now have. And so, it takes time for these policies to sort of roll out and have the effect that they're going to have on a society. So it was the beginning of it, and it was in reaction. Again, another reaction versus a response. It was a reaction to the counterculture of the 60s. Counterculture of the 60s was a reaction to the conservatism that came after the Second World War. And so we have that going on for about a decade, and then in the 90s, it starts to loosen up again. And so the 90s were another time of explosive art, great music, the rise of hip hop in the popular culture, the rise of alternative music. And frankly, just my personal opinion, I don't think we've had great music since the 1990s. We've had little bits here and there, but the 2000s and the 2010s have been an interesting and, if not confusing, time, because we come into the 2000s, 9/11 occurs, and what happens? Conservatism. So we're coming out of the 90s, a very liberal, expansive period of time. 9/11 happens. What seeps in? Fear. Once you get fear, you get conservatism. Those two things are inseparable. Because when you're dealing with creativity and liberalism and the arts and culture and expansive thinking and anything is possible, that led, incidentally, just to point out, all of that wonderful thinking led to the creation of the internet, the creation of the .com, and then the .com bubble bursts around the same time when 9/11's happening. I mean, the bubble was already shaky at that point anyway and starting to crumble. And 9/11 happens, and we were tracked right back into conservatism. So you have the George W. Bush age of conservatism because we have 9/11. Everyone's in fear. We have to protect ourselves. Don't get any funny ideas. Don't think outside of the box. And we have this monetary policy that leads to the 2008 economic collapse. The 2008 economic collapse, what does it do? Usher in more fear. And then there's this weird period between 2009 and 2015 where it's a bit of a wrestling match. There's this the liberal undercurrent of social media's on the rise. There's possibility. People are still investing in new ideas. But the conservative movement is also on the march, building up. So it's had build up since 9/11 and it continues to build up. Finally, we get the election of Donald Trump, who brings in more conservatism. We get hit by a pandemic, more conservatism. So I would say that we are sitting right now in what is effectively a 25-year period of largely conservative dominance that has retracted and tightened and retracted and tightened, and it continues to do that. COVID, what does it do? It's just like 9/11, just like the economic crisis, fear. And the more afraid people get, the more they retract, the more they shrink, and the more conservative they get. So understand the moment of time we're in here. Now, here's the thing. If conservatism is a contraction, try to hold your fist like this as hard as you can. Contract for so long. Just try and hold it. You're not going to be able to hold it for very long. Eventually, there's got to be an explosive release. Enough contraction, we need expansion. Liberalism is expansion, expanded thinking, expanded ideas, expanded possibility. You have the explosion of the arts. I just took you through a very brief synopsis of these periods we've been going through over, since basically after the Second World War, of this expansion, contraction, which is, by the way, a very natural process. The thing that concerns me is that this conservatism moment we're sitting in right now is starting to feel really toxic. It's starting to feel like the fear is at such a level that we're starting to have people just want to give their power away, want to be controlled. This autocratic movement that we're seeing around the world in the conservative circles is people like you and me choosing to lean into more fear and therefore give our power away to the glorious leaders who are going to save us somehow. And that has never worked in human history. It has never worked. It is the most foolish thing we could do. And we're seeing this moment in time where we have an opportunity to either pull back a bit from this conservative inclination and proclivity out of fear, take a breath and ask ourselves, what are we afraid of? And instead of giving our power away, how can we become co-creators to start working together, come up with new ideas to solve the problems? I'm not saying we don't have problems, but the answers are not going to be in a handful of people at the top of the political echelon who are defining a conservative reality to control everyone else. More control is not what we need when we experience a moment of fear. In fact, instead of contraction, what we need to do is lean into expansion, new ideas, new possibilities. We need to work together. We need to stop isolating and seeing each other as others and isolating each other into our own little tribes, pointing fingers and hating at one another, and instead have a conversation. What are my values? What are your values? What's important to you? What's important to me? How can we create something where both of our values can be expressed? These are the types of conversations we need to be having. There are things on the right, on the conservative movement side, that are very useful for us to integrate and to incorporate into solutions for the unknown of the future that we currently face, with artificial intelligence, with climate change, with global migration patterns changing, with the disillusion of globalization. This retraction into our own little island. I mean, it's been said, no man is an island. Why do we keep trying to create islands for ourselves in our tight little tiny conservative communities where we control all the variables? Because you know what? We never do. You can never control all of the variables. And any political leader or movement or authoritarian figure or whatever who says, I got this, I'm your savior, I'm going to control all the variables, it's BS, it's a lie. Nobody does. You do not control. The only thing you control in your life are not the variables, but the only thing that you control in your life is your response to what's going on. Unfortunately, for yourself, you control yourself and how you will respond. But unfortunately, most of us end up in a constant walking, habitual, unconscious reaction to everything in life. And this conservative movement that has stacked and stacked and stacked, it's so ironic. The conservative movement of George W. Bush led to the housing collapse, which led to more conservatism, which led to the rise of the Republican right with Donald Trump, not the old classic Republican right, which actually had a lot of value, but this new, very toxic, cancerous, dysfunctional Republican right, where people are just giving away their power, and hoping that the great leader, the great savior is going to save them. It's never worked. It's never going to work. So we're actually just creating hardship for ourselves. Those of us who have the foresight and the sobriety, the emotional sobriety, which we talk about in whole life architecture at TMIC, to be able to take a breath, observe where there being a reaction to things. This happens in your own life. This happens at the voting booth. This happens in your corporate culture, your organizational culture. You can be someone to influence and help people take a breath and say, okay, how can we pause, and instead of reacting and continuing to constrict what's possible, how can we take a breath and be a response and together collaborate and create something? This is not philosophical, incidentally. If I'm at war with you and you're at war with me, and we're both in our conservative little shells based out of fear, trying to protect this little thing, we've given our power away to some person who supposedly has all the answers. There isn't a human on planet Earth that has all the answers, so this is a fantasy. If we continue to do that, we're going nowhere. We're going nowhere, and you're going to see war and violence and the total destruction of our society, when what we should do is say, what about the way we've structured our society is still useful for this moment? What parts need to change? Now, here's why that's very difficult to do. Those who are in power don't like change, because it means changing the terms and conditions and the dynamics upon which their power is based. So if anything, what we need is not to be divided societally into two separate camps, but we need to invite each other from both sides, create bridges between both sides, to have a broader conversation about what are the power dynamics that are currently at work that are dysfunctional, that have an interest in keeping us divided and separate, that want to keep us divided and separate so that they can maintain power. I mean, just think about it. If I've got all the power, I've got all the money, I've got all the influence, the best thing that can happen to me is to create the conditions where the people are distracted, fighting each other, and they're leaving me alone. They're just not touching me. And I just throw little idea bombs into that chaos of the left and the right fighting each other every once in a while, just to like stoking a fire, just adding wood to the fire every once in a while. What needs to happen is we who are in the fire, who are on either the left or the right, but are part of the masses, need to look at each other and say, you are not my enemy, I'm not your enemy. You have valuable things to share, I have valuable things to share. Together we can come together, collaborate, and co-create. And we can actually start to create the conditions for a new society, which we need, because we're in a moment of change right now where the level of change, the complexity of change, the nature of change in this moment requires new ideas. There are certain conservative principles that we can look back to and we could say, okay, these may or may not still work. Let's evaluate them. But a lot of what the future is going to entail hasn't been created yet. You know, Dell put out a study actually about 5-6 years ago now, but they still got it on their website, Dell Computers, that says that the jobs that we will be doing in 2030, I really want you to get this and let this sit in. The jobs that we will be doing in 2030 haven't been invented yet. 85%, they say, of the jobs we will be doing haven't been invented yet. Just let that sit in. There's an 85% chance that the job you're doing won't exist in 2030 or won't exist in the same way that you're currently doing it. Because the jobs, according to them, 85% of the jobs haven't been invented. Wow, think about that. They haven't been invented, so we can't plan for it. We don't know how to study, prepare, and train ourselves for it because it hasn't been invented. Well, who's going to invent it? Who's going to invent where we're headed economically, politically, culturally, socially? And even if Dell is wrong, which is a high probability they're not going to be dead on with this, let's say it's not 85%, it's just 30%. That's still incredible. We have not seen a 30% economic reconstitution and recreation since the Second World War. So that's just one example of how the unknown we face, the conservative leaning principle is to look to the past for answers, just shows there are no answers in the past. The jobs haven't been created yet. Looking back in 1950 in the good old days and seeing how we worked back then offers us no solutions for a world that is run by AI, that is largely digital, that is largely remote, and where the value systems are completely being reconstituted and recreated as we speak. And we are the ones as individuals, and then as our families, and then as our communities, and then as you broaden out your state, your country, countries, we are the ones who have to take a pause, stop being a reaction, stop being fearful, figure out where the fear is in ourselves, and shift to start thinking, I'm going to be a creator of the future. I want to collaborate with other people. I want to stop fighting with people based on political party ideology. Ideologies lead nowhere. It's only humans coming together with the ability to listen and hear one another deeply from a values level, not from an ideological level, from a values level. You know, I think about a lot of the people in the conservative movement, let's say in the United States, who are, pro-guns, pro-family, pro-religion, all of these sorts of things. And in a non-extreme, non-reactionary place, there's some value to what the right wing of the American political spectrum is arguing for. But unfortunately, many on the left won't even listen to that. And vice versa. There is value in what the left is arguing for. When you look at the baseline of what's driving everything, people want to have a good life. They want to protect their families. They want to be able to eat clean food. They want to breathe clean air. They want to be able to earn a living and have an economy that they can participate in. And fighting will not produce that. Nor will a reactionary swing to the extreme of either side will not produce that either. And so we have got to pause ourselves. We have got to individually slow down, stop critiquing. I invite you to challenge your thinking by listening to media and ideas from the other side of your political spectrum. I invite you to go talk to people who are outside of your normal community that you're comfortable with. Don't spend all your time hanging out with people who are preaching to the converted. Put yourself in an uncomfortable place and consider and get curious and ask yourself what's under the motivation of why people on the left or the right believe what they believe. Let's start having a dialogue and a conversation instead of feeding into the division that those who do currently control the levers of power want us to continue fighting each other. Let's start to create together. The most important conversations, TMICglobal.com, is a community that stands for that. That stands for creativity as the highest expression of what it means to be human. And whether you're on the left or the right, we are all creators by nature. Human beings are naturally creators. And right now, we have an option to create or to war with one another. And right now, the warring side tends to be the noisiest, tends to be the easiest for us to drop into. And that's just because the brain naturally goes to what is negative. It's a survival mechanism. Our brain is always scanning and seeking what's going on in our environment that's a threat. And so when untrained and undisciplined, our mind will always see the threats and not see the things that we hold in common and not see the possibility of what can be created together. So it's going to take pausing, slowing down. It's going to take effort, and recognize that extreme conservative movements are founded in fear. If you think about it, conservative movements, they want to freeze time. The good old days were the 1950s or maybe the 1960s or whatever the good old days were for you. But that is not a solution for where we're headed. Those days have passed. And on the left, we have a tendency to, that's why I think it's so interesting, the whole Reagan deregulation thing. I would have thought that would have come from a liberal-leaning political movement, because the left tends to be less rules. If freedom has a home, it is not in conservatism. Traditionally, if you really think about what these ideas mean. If freedom and possibility and potentiality has a home, it is firmly in the left or the liberal camp of the ideological spectrum. However, we need to be grounded and rooted to something. So sometimes the liberal movement is like a balloon that is no longer tethered to the ground, and it flies off and it just goes into wild places. That has been happening because the liberal movement has been in reaction to the conservative movement that has dominated the last 24, 25 years. And so a lot of what we're seeing right now in some of the more wild liberal ideas are just a reaction to conservatism that is constraining and choking the life out of life. And we are in one of those camps. And I invite all of the listeners and watchers of this post to just breathe and take a moment and say, what kind of life do I want? There are things about the conservative movement that can be beneficial, but not in its extreme form. There are things about the liberal movement that are incredibly beneficial and important to what it means to express ourselves as human beings and to feel the freedom of creativity and possibility. But in its extreme form, it also will cause a problem and become dysfunctional. We have dysfunction in both camps. Neither side is 100% right, but both sides hold the possibility of the seeds of something new. And we need to create something new. We need the creativity of the liberal left, and we need the firm foundation building of the right, of the conservative right. If you think existing in one of the extremes is a path forward, then we're all screwed. So I invite you to reconsider, if you're conservative, what is that? What is the life you actually want to see? And it can't be on the extremes. And if you're on the liberal left, same thing. We've got to bring some sanity into this moment, and we've got to start creating together. As human beings, we are natural creators. We're creating even when we don't realize we're creating. And I talk a lot about that on other posts, and we deal a lot with that. We have a program called the Life by Design Lab in TMIC, TMICglobal.com, that specifically focuses on applying our curriculum of whole life architecture to your life, where you literally redesign your life in a lab. You get really firmly grounded and rooted in what your values are, what drives you, what inspires you, what motivates you, and then you apply that to your life. And it's not easy work. We call it an after the hype program because there's a lot of people who just want to go get a dopamine hit at a workshop or a conference, high five, walk on coals, do all the things that we've all heard people do, having these ecstatic experiences. And I'm not making those wrong. There's a place for those. Those types of experiences help inspire and motivate us. But if you want to know why 98% of people who ever spend any kind of money on self-help and personal development programs, content, work, or whatever, only 98% of them never apply and get the benefit from it, it's because there's work to be done. You didn't become who you were in 3 days, so why do you think a 3-day conference is going to transform you? It's not. Anyway, we do this work to activate the creator within, and our intention is to start to heal the wounds of society, one person at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. You can either exhaust all your energy fighting and hating one another, or you can actually step into your power as a creator and say, I am going to, like Gandhi, it wasn't exactly Gandhi who said, be the change you want to see. That was a riff on what he said. But like he's known for saying, be the change you want to see in the world. But it's on you. And it's on you talking to your friends and your family. It's on you talking to your coworkers. It's on you talking to different communities you're a part of, posting this on social media, sharing this video. The insanity has to stop, and on either side there's insanity when you're at the extremes. And it's human nature. We don't have an off switch. But if we don't find an off switch, we're devolving into something that nobody is going to enjoy. Nobody is going to thrive in. The idea that civil war is being talked about as a solution shows you how lost many are starting to get, how desperate, how fearful, how reactive, how non-creative, non-inspiring, non-interesting. So I invite you to check out TMICglobal.com. We're going to have more of this type of topic as we go forward here. I would encourage all of you listening and watching to just take a breather. And if you need some help to figure out what it is that you really believe and what your life could look like, we'd be happy to assist you at the most important conversations, TMICglobal.com, in the Life by Design Lab and the Whole Life Architecture program. Until then, wishing you all the best, and we will talk to you soon.